The morning had started like any other in the quiet suburban neighborhood. Birds chirped, sprinklers clicked on, and the sun crept over neat rows of identical rooftops. Families bustled inside their homes, preparing for school and work. But by the time the clock struck 9, the entire street's attention was fixed on one house, one driveway, and one vehicle that refused to move. It was an oversized SUV, jet black with tinted windows, parked diagonally across the concrete drive of a modest, two-story home. The angle was deliberate, obstructing not just the driveway but also part of the street itself. No one in the neighborhood was surprised by whose vehicle it was. Everyone recognized the car. It belonged to Margaret Shaw, a member of the Homeowners Association Board. Known for her stern face, endless rule enforcement, and unwavering need to control every detail of the neighborhood, Margaret had built a reputation that teetered between authority and intimidation. That morning, however, she wasn't just enforcing rules. She was making a statement. The homeowner whose driveway was blocked, a man named David, had long been at odds with Margaret. Their disputes went back months: landscaping fines, noise complaints, even arguments about the color of his shutters. Each confrontation had escalated, but until now, the feud had stayed confined to written warnings and tense exchanges. Today, Margaret had crossed into something far more personal. David stood outside, pacing along the curb. His wife filmed from the porch, recording every second of the standoff. Neighbors trickled out of their homes, murmuring in hushed tones as they watched. The SUV sat like a barricade, a blunt display of control, and Margaret herself could be seen inside. She sat behind the wheel, motionless, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her face obscured by dark sunglasses. Hours ticked by, and though neighbors approached her window and gestured for her to move, she remained completely still, ignoring them all. By noon, the situation had transformed from an inconvenience into a full-blown spectacle. Children riding. Bikes stopped to stare. Cars slowed as they passed. Margaret's SUV hadn't budged an inch. It was as if she had dug herself into the driveway, determined to hold her ground until something. The homeowner called the police more than once, reporting that his driveway was being deliberately blocked. The dispatcher promised an officer would be sent, but response times stretched thin as calls for more urgent matters took priority. When the first patrol car finally rolled onto the street, the crowd of neighbors swelled in anticipation. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The law would intervene. The officer, a middle-aged man with mirrored sunglasses, approached the SUV calmly. He tapped the window once, then again. Margaret turned her head slightly, acknowledging him but refusing to lower the window. The officer gestured toward the driveway, speaking firmly but without raising his voice. Still, she did not respond. The officer called for backup, and soon a second patrol car arrived. 2 more officers stepped out, scanning the scene, already sensing that this would not be a routine call. What struck them almost immediately was Margaret's complete lack of reaction. She didn't argue, didn't gesture, didn't even open her mouth. She sat stone still, her sunglasses concealing her eyes, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. When one officer tried the handle of the driver's side door, it was locked. He tapped again, more firmly this time. Margaret shook her head once, slowly, but did not speak. The crowd of neighbors buzzed with speculation. Some thought it was a power move, that she was daring the police to tow her SUV. Others whispered that maybe she had finally snapped under the pressure of her HOA duties, unraveling into stubborn silence. A few wondered if she was hiding something, if there was more inside that vehicle than anyone realized. By mid-afternoon, the situation had grown tense. The officers requested that Margaret exit the vehicle. She shook her head again, her jaw tight, lips pressed together. They warned her of the consequences: impoundment, fines, even arrest. Still, she refused. Hours had passed, and still, she would not budge. The officers began documenting everything, radios crackling as they called in additional units. What baffled them most was her calm demeanor. This wasn't the panic of someone cornered, nor the arrogance of someone flaunting authority. This was something else, something calculated, something they couldn't quite place. Finally, as dusk approached, a senior officer arrived on the scene. He had been briefed on the bizarre standoff and walked up to the SUV with deliberate caution. He crouched near the window, studying Margaret closely. Then, for the first time, she made a move. She lowered her sunglasses just enough for her eyes to meet his. What he saw made him freeze. Her pupils were wide, her gaze unblinking, her face pale in the dimming light. She mouthed something, slow and deliberate, but the words were impossible to hear through the glass. The officer stood, stepping back. Something about the look in her eyes unsettled him. This was no longer about a blocked driveway. There was something deeper happening inside that vehicle, something that went beyond petty HOA disputes. Neighbors leaned closer, straining to see what was happening. The officers huddled, whispering, their faces serious. Whatever they had just witnessed had changed their entire approach. No longer were they treating this as a simple act of defiance. No longer was this just about a stubborn board member refusing to move her car. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. And it was at that exact moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon and sirens wailed in the distance, that the police realized this was not the simple neighborhood drama they thought it was. This was something else entirely, something darker, something hidden, something waiting to be uncovered. The crowd fell silent, sensing the shift in the air, the driveway, the SUV, the still figure inside. It all felt different now. The officers tightened their stance, preparing for the unexpected. Because whatever reason Margaret had for refusing to get out of her car, it was no longer about the driveway. It was about survival. The crowd of neighbors lingered even as the streetlights flickered on. Children had been ushered back inside, but adults remained, arms crossed, voices low, eyes glued to the SUV. The once mundane cul-de-sac now carried an air of unease, as though something heavy and unseen pressed against everyone's chest. The officers tried again to coax Margaret out. Their tone was firm, but beneath the authority lay an undercurrent of concern. Each attempt ended the same way, with Margaret shaking her head, lips sealed, eyes locked forward, as if anchored to something beyond the windshield. It was not the behavior of a defiant woman staking her ground. It was the behavior of someone trapped, bound not by physical restraint but by fear. One officer circled the SUV slowly, peering through the tinted glass. He pressed his flashlight against the back window, straining to see inside. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing only shadows, the faint glint of metallic surfaces, and something draped over the back seat. At first glance it looked like a blanket, but the longer he stared, the less certain he became. Its shape was uneven, stiff in places where fabric should have fallen naturally. He called another officer over, but when both looked again, Margaret shifted suddenly in her seat, her shoulders tensing as though she sensed their curiosity. The movement was enough to make them step back. The senior officer ordered them to hold their ground. Whatever was inside, Margaret was guarding it with absolute resolve. Meanwhile, tension spread among the neighbors. They began whispering theories. Maybe she had weapons in the car, maybe evidence of a crime, maybe something she couldn't allow anyone to see. David, whose driveway was still blocked, paced furiously, torn between anger and dread. This had started as an inconvenience, a power struggle. But now even he could feel the shift. Margaret wasn't simply making a point. She was hiding something. An hour later, additional units arrived. A canine handler led a German shepherd toward the vehicle, letting the dog circle and sniff along the edges. The animal's ears perked, its posture stiffening as it lingered near the passenger side door. It whined, pawing at the bottom of the door frame. The handler tugged gently at its leash, but the dog resisted, its attention locked firmly on the SUV's interior. That was the first undeniable sign that something inside wasn't normal. The officers regrouped, debating their options. Breaking into the vehicle without cause risked liability, but leaving it untouched posed potential danger, not just to Margaret, but to everyone in the neighborhood. The senior officer glanced again at the woman inside. Her face had gone pale, sweat glistening along her hairline, but still she refused to unlock the door. Every request was met with the same rigid shake of her head. The decision was made to escalate carefully. They requested the fire department on standby in case forcible. Entry was necessary. An ambulance was called as a precaution. Red and blue lights filled the cul-de-sac, their reflection bouncing off garage doors and windows, giving the entire street the appearance of a crime scene. Inside her SUV, Margaret sat as still as stone. Her hands hadn't moved from the steering wheel for hours. Only her eyes shifted, darting occasionally toward the rearview mirror. She wasn't looking at the officers. She was looking behind her, always behind her. The senior officer couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret wasn't protecting herself from them, but protecting them from what was inside. Finally, after hours of standoff, the officers decided to make their move. One approached with a slim Jim, preparing to unlock the driver's side door manually. As the tool slid between the glass and the seal, Margaret's composure broke. For the first time all day, she moved violently, slamming her palm against the window, shaking her head frantically, mouthing words that none of them could hear. Her expression was not one of anger, but of desperation, almost pleading. The officer froze, startled by her sudden intensity. He stepped back, exchanging uneasy glances with the others. If she was hiding evidence, she wouldn't be begging them not to enter. If she was guilty of a crime, she wouldn't be terrified of their interference. Something else was at play, something more sinister than neighborhood politics or HOA disputes. The senior officer signaled to hold off. They needed more information. One officer returned to his patrol car, running the SUV's license plate again, digging deeper into Margaret's records. What came back only added to the confusion. Margaret had no criminal record, no outstanding warrants, no history of erratic behavior. She was a retired accountant, a board member, a woman whose reputation for being controlling masked an otherwise uneventful life. So why was she sitting in her car as though stepping out meant certain death? The hours dragged on. Midnight approached, yet the SUV remained in place, its headlights now off, its interior cloaked in darkness. Still, Margaret sat there, rigid, her silhouette barely moving. The crowd of neighbors had thinned, but a few stayed behind, unable to turn away from the unfolding mystery. Then, just as the officers were considering forcing entry despite her protests, one of them spotted something, movement in the back seat. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but enough to catch the beam of a flashlight. Something shifted beneath the odd, stiff covering. For a moment, it looked like the rise and fall of breathing. The officer stepped back quickly, his pulse racing. He gestured to the others, pointing toward the rear of the vehicle. Margaret's eyes followed their gestures, and in that instant, her mask of calm broke. Her lips parted, her face contorted in silent fear, and tears welled in her eyes. She shook her head violently, pressing her palm to the glass again, pleading without words for them to stop. The officers froze, the weight of realization dawning on them. Whatever was in that back seat wasn't just an object. It wasn't just contraband or hidden documents. It was something alive, and judging by Margaret's terror, it wasn't something safe. The street went silent, every neighbor holding their breath. The officers exchanged a look, the gravity of the situation sinking in. This wasn't about a driveway anymore. This wasn't even about Margaret's defiance. It was about what was lurking just a few feet behind her, hidden in the dark, waiting. And the longer she refused to get out, the clearer it became. She wasn't trapped in that car by choice. She was trapped by fear of what was inside it. The night pressed in heavily on the neighborhood, and with it came a silence broken only by the distant hum of patrol radios and the restless shuffling of officers. The SUV, once simply a blockade in a driveway, now felt like a sealed container, holding something far more dangerous than an act of petty defiance. The discovery of movement in the back seat shifted the mood from frustration to dread. What had first been dismissed as an HOA power play now resembled something out of a nightmare. Margaret's posture told the story no one wanted to accept. She wasn't guarding the SUV, she was imprisoned by it. Every time the officers approached, the rear of the vehicle, her hands tightened on the steering wheel, her head shaking violently as though to warn them back. Her face had become pale and drawn, and the tension in her shoulders gave away the exhaustion of holding herself together for so many hours. Whatever was in the back seat wasn't just her secret, it was her terror. The officers gathered near the patrol cars, their conversations hushed. None of them wanted to say aloud what they were all thinking. If the SUV contained another person, why weren't they revealing themselves? If it contained something dangerous, how had Margaret been sitting there so long without leaving? None of it added up, and yet the evidence of movement was undeniable. One officer suggested deploying a spotlight to flood the interior with light and force whatever was inside into view. Another countered that the sudden brightness might provoke an unpredictable reaction. The senior officer weighed both sides but ultimately held back. Every instinct told him this wasn't a situation that could be solved with force or pressure. There was something fragile, precarious about the way Margaret sat, her fear balanced on a knife's edge. The K9 handler lingered near the passenger side again, his dog whining softly, ears pricked forward. The animal's unease carried its own kind of authority, a primal recognition of danger. Dogs sensed things that humans couldn't, and whatever was in that SUV had unsettled even the trained animal. The handler tugged gently at the leash, but the dog refused to leave, pawing at the door as if drawn to something it couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, the neighbors who had stayed behind murmured amongst themselves. Theories spiraled wildly. Some whispered about kidnappings, others about fugitives hiding in plain sight. The longer the SUV sat unmoved, the darker the rumors became. For them, this was no longer about Margaret's stubbornness. This was about survival. Hers, and perhaps theirs. As the clock pushed past 1 in the morning, the officers decided to escalate carefully. One of them crouched low near the rear bumper, flashlight in hand, and angled the beam just enough to illuminate the yaw backseat from below. The light cut across the upholstery, revealing the edge of that strange, draped covering. It shimmered faintly, the texture too rigid to be cloth, too irregular to be ordinary. Then, in a chilling moment, the covering shifted. Not because of the wind, not because of Margaret's movement, but because something underneath it stirred. The officer stumbled back, his chest tight. The senior officer saw his face pale, and that was enough to confirm it. There was indeed something alive in that SUV, something hidden deliberately, something Margaret was willing to sacrifice her freedom to keep contained. Inside, Margaret's eyes darted toward the rearview mirror again, her lips forming silent words that no one could hear. Her hands gripped the wheel until her knuckles blanched. Every breath she took seemed measured, controlled, as though even the act of exhaling too loudly might disturb whatever shared the vehicle with her. Then came the sound. Subtle, muffled, but enough to freeze the officers in place. A thud, slow, deliberate, from inside the SUV's back seat. It wasn't the clatter of loose objects, nor the creak of shifting weight. It was something heavy, restrained, pressing, against the confines of its prison. The senior officer ordered everyone back a step, widening the perimeter. Whatever was inside wasn't just unusual, it was potentially dangerous. And Margaret's refusal to leave wasn't the arrogance of a board member on a power trip. It was the act of a woman who knew that opening the door might unleash something none of them could control. The fire department, still on standby, prepared their tools. Hydraulic cutters, crowbars, heavy equipment, all waiting for a signal to breach the SUV. But the officers hesitated. Forcing the vehicle open without knowing what lay inside could risk lives. Not just Margaret's, but theirs as well. Every decision felt weighted with consequence. Margaret remained a silent sentinel, her eyes red from exhaustion, tears streaking her cheeks. She had been in that car for nearly 16 hours now, her body stiff, her mind locked in the grip of dread. Whatever she was enduring, it wasn't stubbornness, it was survival. And the longer she stayed, the clearer it became that she wasn't holding the SUV hostage. She was holding something within it at bay. By 3 a.m, the neighborhood was cloaked in an eerie stillness. The SUV sat illuminated by spotlights, a stage for a mystery that no one dared resolve. Officers rotated shifts, keeping constant watch, unwilling to leave Margaret alone but equally unwilling to provoke her into opening the door. Every small sound from inside the vehicle heightened the tension. Scrapes, faint movements, the occasional dull thump. The senior officer knew they couldn't hold this standoff forever. At some point, Margaret's body would give out. Exhaustion would win, and she would either collapse or be forced to make a choice. Either way, time was their enemy. As the first pale streaks of dawn broke over the rooftops, Margaret shifted in her seat. For the first time, she looked directly at the officers. Outside her window, her expression hollow but resolute. Then she raised her hand slowly and pointed, not at them, not at the driveway, but toward the back seat. The gesture sent a chill through everyone watching. It was not an invitation. It was a warning. And in that instant, the officers realized they were not dealing with a standoff anymore. They were dealing with containment. Whatever was in that SUV was the true reason Margaret hadn't stepped out, and soon they would have no choice but to face it. Morning light revealed just how long the ordeal had dragged on. Margaret had now spent nearly 24 hours inside the SUV, her body stiff, her face pale, her strength clearly waning. Her once sharp appearance as the no-nonsense HOA board member had deteriorated into something fragile, desperate and haunted. Yet still she refused to leave. The SUV had become both her prison and her shield, and stepping out meant exposing everyone, including herself, to whatever waited in the back seat. The officers, now joined by county deputies and specialized units, had expanded the perimeter. Yellow tape cordoned off the street, pushing back the remaining neighbors who clung to their lawns and driveways for a better view. What had begun as petty neighborhood drama had become a full-scale incident, with law enforcement treating the SUV as a potential crime scene, or worse, a containment zone. The senior officer's mind raced with possibilities. Could it be a hostage, restrained in silence? Could it be an animal, dangerous and unpredictable? Or was it something far stranger, something Margaret herself didn't understand but recognized as a threat? Each theory was plausible, yet none explained why she would spend an entire day inside a vehicle, starving herself of food, water, and rest, just to ensure that the back seat remained sealed. Attempts to communicate had failed. Margaret had stopped responding entirely, her eyes locked either forward through the windshield or backward into the rearview mirror. It was as though she had reduced her existence to 2 fixed points: the present she endured, and the danger behind her. Officers debated breaching the SUV, but each time they drew closer, Margaret's body stiffened with such violent alarm that even the most seasoned deputies hesitated. Her fear was contagious. The fire crew remained on standby, their tools ready. The paramedics kept their gurney prepared, knowing it was only a matter of time before Margaret collapsed. Still, hours slipped away. The summer sun climbed higher, baking the SUV's dark metal frame, heating the air inside to unbearable levels. Sweat soaked Margaret's clothes, her breaths shallow, yet her resolve never wavered. If anything, the rising temperature made her grip on the steering wheel even tighter, her gaze even sharper. She wasn't just enduring the conditions, she was fighting them, willing herself to stay awake, to stay alive, as though the cost of surrendering to exhaustion would unleash something catastrophic. Then came the sound again. Louder this time. A deliberate thump from the back seat, followed by a dragging scrape across the upholstery. Officers froze, every head snapping toward the SUV. Margaret flinched violently, her lips parting in a soundless gasp, tears welling in her eyes. She mouthed words again, her face twisted with silent desperation, and though no one could hear, the meaning was unmistakable. Do not open it. The K9, agitated and restless, barked sharply, pulling against its leash. The dog's instincts confirmed what everyone already felt. The presence of something unnatural, something that didn't belong. Even the neighbors beyond the tape fell quiet, their curiosity replaced by unease. Finally, the senior officer made a decision. They could no longer allow this standoff to continue. Margaret's health was failing, and the longer she sat in that SUV, the greater the risk became, not just for her but for everyone. The command was given. A tactical entry team would move in, open the doors, and take control of whatever lay inside. But as the team approached, Margaret's reaction was unlike anything they had expected. She pounded her fists against the glass, her face contorted with such raw terror that even the most hardened deputies faltered. Her head shook violently, her hands clawing at the air, her entire body screaming a warning without words. She wasn't afraid of being arrested. She wasn't afraid of losing her car. She was afraid for them. The tactical unit hesitated, but the order stood. Slowly, methodically, they positioned themselves around the SUV. Tools were readied, shields raised. The moment was tense, every breath in the crowd suspended, every eye locked on the black vehicle that had held the neighborhood hostage for nearly a day. And then, as if the SUV itself responded to the threat of intrusion, the movement inside escalated. A heavy slam rattled the frame, shaking the glass in its seal. Margaret screamed silently, her mouth open in horror as the draped covering in the back seat shifted violently. It was no longer a subtle stir or faint thump. It was a violent struggle, as though something had awoken fully, no longer content to remain hidden. The dog barked furiously, straining at its leash. Officers raised their weapons, unsure what they were about to face. The tactical team froze mid-motion, caught between the command to enter and the primal instinct to retreat. And then, for the first time, the covering slipped. Just slightly, just enough for the flashlight beams to catch the glint of something beneath it. It wasn't skin, it wasn't fabric, it was metallic, jagged, with edges that reflected light in irregular, unnatural ways. The glimpse was brief, but it was enough to send a chill down every spine. Margaret's entire body convulsed in terror. She slammed her hand against the glass again, tears streaming down her face, her mouth forming the same desperate warning. Don't. The senior officer felt the weight of the decision pressing down harder than ever. Breaching the SUV could expose them all to whatever waited in the back seat. Yet leaving it sealed meant condemning Margaret to a death by exhaustion, dehydration, or worse. The very thing she was holding at bay might escape on its own. The choice was impossible, but it had to be made. The order was adjusted. They would wait, observe, contain. No forced entry. Not yet. Margaret's fear had bought them hesitation, and hesitation might be the only thing keeping them alive. The morning dragged into afternoon, the sun blazing overhead. Margaret's condition worsened. Her breaths came shallow and ragged, her head sagging toward the steering wheel, but still she clung to consciousness. Her survival instinct was fierce, almost inhuman, fueled not by stubbornness, but by raw terror. She was the barrier. And the officers knew, with growing certainty, that if she collapsed before they understood what was inside, they might all pay the price. By late afternoon, as shadows stretched across the street, a grim truth settled over the scene. Margaret could not hold out much longer, and when she broke, the SUV would no longer be contained. The officers prepared themselves for the inevitable, because sooner or later they would have to open that door. By the time the second night fell, The cul-de-sac resembled something out of a lockdown zone. Police cruisers lined the street, their headlights casting sharp beams across the pavement. Fire trucks idled quietly, their engines rumbling like restless beasts. The ambulance remained stationed nearby, paramedics leaning against its doors with grim expressions. What had once been a suburban spectacle had now transformed into an emergency the entire county had become aware of, and at the center of it all, still unmoving, sat Margaret's SUV. Inside, Margaret looked like a ghost of herself. She had not eaten, had not drunk water, had not left her seat in nearly 40 hours. Her body was collapsing under the weight of exhaustion, yet she clung to consciousness with every ounce of strength she had left. Her face was pale, her lips cracked, her clothes drenched in sweat. But her eyes, they remained locked on the rearview mirror, fixated on the shadow in the back seat. It had grown louder. The muffled noises that had once been occasional were now constant. The thuds, the scraping, the subtle vibrations of something, shifting its weight inside the SUV. At first it had seemed sporadic, but now it carried a rhythm, a deliberate intent. Each movement pressed harder against the covering, testing the boundaries that held it back. Each sound carried the dreadful implication that containment was temporary. The officers, though trained for crises, felt unnerved in ways they hadn't anticipated. None of their manuals covered this. A neighbor dispute unraveling into something that defied reason. Weapons remained holstered, but hands twitched closer to holsters with every echo from inside the vehicle. Radios crackled with updates from command, yet every directive felt hollow. Hold the perimeter. Observe the suspect. Wait for orders. The waiting had become unbearable, because with each passing hour, the question loomed larger. What if waiting was exactly what it wanted? The tactical team rotated shifts, watching the SUV with an intensity reserved for dangerous animals. Each time a flashlight swept across the back seat, glimpses of the covering revealed fresh shifts in shape. Once, an outline pressed hard against the fabric, as if straining to push through. Another time, the metallic glint returned, sharper, clearer, like teeth catching light. Each glimpse only deepened the mystery, tightening the knot of dread. Margaret's resolve faltered. Her eyelids drooped, her head sagged, her grip on the steering wheel weakened. But whenever her body threatened to give way to unconsciousness, a sudden movement from the back jolted her awake, terror snapping her upright again. She was keeping herself alive through sheer force of will, but her body had limits, and those limits were nearly reached. The senior officer knew it. He could see the fragility in her frame, the inevitability in her decline. Soon, whether by collapse or by choice, Margaret would no longer be able to serve as the barrier between the officers and whatever waited in the shadows of the SUV. Then, as the clock ticked past midnight, the inevitable happened. A sharp, tearing sound echoed from the back seat. It was unlike the muffled thuds before. It was sharper, more violent, like fabric giving way under pressure. Officers jerked toward the sound, their flashlights darting across the SUV. Inside, Margaret's body convulsed with fear. Her head whipped back, her eyes widening in horror, her hands clawing at the steering wheel as though anchoring herself against what she knew was coming. The covering shifted violently, slipping down just enough to reveal more of what lay beneath. Shapes protruded from the darkness, angular, irregular, glinting faintly in the beams of light. The officers saw enough to know this wasn't human, nor animal in any sense they understood. It was something mechanical, yet alive, something jagged that moved with intention, not accident. The dog barked wildly, snapping at the air, pulling its handler dangerously close to the SUV. Margaret's eyes locked on the animal, then darted back to the officers outside, her mouth moving in frantic, silent pleas. She knew what was happening. She had known all along. And now, for the first time, the officers caught a glimpse of the truth she had been holding back. The SUV wasn't just a car, and the back seat wasn't just hiding a shape. It was a container, barely holding something that should never have been inside. The tearing sound came again, louder this time, followed by a metallic clang against the glass. The SUV shuddered with the force of the impact. Margaret screamed without sound, her fists slamming against the dashboard, her body shaking as if she could hold the thing back by sheer willpower. The officers scrambled, shouting orders, raising, weapons, forming a tighter perimeter. Floodlights snapped on, bathing the SUV in harsh white light. Shadows spilled across the pavement, elongating the figure of Margaret as she clung to the steering wheel, like a woman awaiting execution. The senior officer made the call to breach. It was no longer a matter of waiting. Margaret was seconds away from collapse, and the SUV was seconds away from breaking its seal. Whatever was inside was ready to come out. The tactical team advanced. Shields raised, tools in hand, they surrounded the vehicle. The dog barked and lunged until it had to be pulled back by force. Paramedics readied themselves at the tape, their faces pale as they watched. Neighbors, who had refused to retreat despite the orders, clutched each other in silence, their fear palpable. The tactical leader gave the signal. A crowbar was wedged against the rear door, pressure applied. Margaret thrashed violently in the driver's seat, shaking her head, pounding the glass, tears pouring down her face. Her body seemed to collapse under the weight of dread as she mouthed one last, desperate warning. And then, as the metal screeched and the door began to give, the entire SUV rocked violently from within. The covering in the back tore open fully, exposing something that caught the floodlights in a blinding reflection. The crowd gasped, officers stumbled back, and for one chilling moment, no one could comprehend what they were seeing. Margaret slumped forward, her strength finally gone. And behind her, the thing in the back seat stirred, no longer hidden, no longer contained. The seal had cracked. What came next would change everything. The instant the backseat covering split open, the entire street fell into chaos. For 2 long days, tension had lingered like a storm on the horizon, but now the storm had broken. The floodlights caught the jagged silhouette of something that had no right to exist within a suburban cul-de-sac. Shards of metal jutted outward, interlocking like fractured armor. Beneath them, a pulsing glow emanated, dull at first, then intensifying as though fueled by its own awakening. Officers stumbled back, their training no match for the incomprehensible sight. For the first time since arriving, they no longer saw a stubborn HOA board member holding up her neighborhood. They saw a woman who had been holding something else back, something none of them wanted to believe was real until it stood before them. Margaret, weak and trembling, had fought against the inevitable for as long as she could. Her refusal to leave the SUV had not been defiance. It had been a desperate attempt to keep this very moment from arriving. The object inside shifted again, a metallic screech reverberating against the SUV's frame. The sound carried down the street, rattling windows and stirring fear in every onlooker. For a moment, it seemed contained, unable to push beyond the vehicle's shell. But then the rear window fractured in a spiderweb pattern, shards of glass, falling to the pavement. Through the crack, more of its form pressed outward, something that looked part machine, part creature, forged of steel yet moving with a dreadful, lifelike precision. Margaret collapsed against the steering wheel, her body drained of every reserve of energy. The officers who had once barked orders now stood frozen, caught between duty and disbelief. Their radios crackled with frantic demands from command, but no voice among them could override the primal instinct to flee. The SUV rocked violently once more, and the door that had been pried open moments before was flung wide as though by its own force. From the shadows, the thing began to emerge. Its surface reflected the lights like liquid metal, each edge sharper than the next. Mechanical limbs curled and extended with unnatural fluidity, each movement accompanied by a resonant hum. At its core, a glow pulsed steadily, almost like a heartbeat, illuminating its form with an eerie rhythm. This was no ordinary contraption, no harmless device left forgotten in a back seat. It was something alive, or at least aware, and now it was free, The dog barked frantically, pulling against its handler's grip with the desperation of an animal sensing doom. Neighbors screamed, retreating toward the safety of their porches, though there was no true safety to be found anywhere nearby. The paramedics who had waited so long to help Margaret now stood paralyzed, their gurney abandoned in the street, and through it all, Margaret barely lifted her head. With the last of her strength, she tilted her face toward the rearview mirror. Her lips moved soundlessly, forming words too faint for anyone to hear. But her expression told the story that no one had wanted to believe until this moment. She had stayed in that car, not to defy them, not to cause chaos, but because she knew she was the final barrier holding the thing in place. Now the barrier had broken. The officers regained their composure just enough to act. Weapons were raised, flashlights steadied, commands shouted into the chaos, but no amount of training could disguise the fact that they had no idea what they were facing. They had prepared for a standoff with a stubborn homeowner, not for a metallic presence that seemed to blur the line between machine and predator. Bullets might not even matter. Nothing they had brought might matter. The creature, if it could be called that, emerged fully from the SUV. The entire vehicle sagged, as though relieved of an unbearable weight, its suspension creaking before finally giving way. The glow within, the creature intensified, spilling onto the asphalt in jagged beams. For the first time, its face tilted upward, catching the gaze of every terrified witness. It had no eyes, no mouth, no features that belonged to anything natural, yet its presence carried the undeniable weight of awareness. In that moment, the officers finally realized the truth of why Margaret had refused to leave her car. She had not been stubborn, nor delusional, nor irrational. She had been protecting them from this. She had trapped herself inside that SUV because she had known the second she stepped out, she would no longer have the strength to keep the thing contained. Her silence, her refusal, her exhaustion, it had all been the last stand of a woman who bore the burden alone until her body could no longer fight. Margaret slumped completely now, unconscious or worse, her frame limp against the seatbelt. The moment she did, the glow within the creature surged brighter, its movements sharper, as if it sensed its restraint had been lifted. The senior officer shouted an order, but his words were drowned out by the sudden screech of metal on pavement. The creature's limbs dug into the asphalt, carving grooves as it advanced. Weapons fired, muzzle flashes lighting up the night. Sparks flew as bullets ricocheted off its surface, useless against its armored form. Neighbors screamed louder, doors slammed, floodlights snapped off in panic. The street was chaos, pure and unfiltered, and in the midst of it, the realization struck every witness like a blow to the chest. Margaret had not been the villain in this story. She had been its reluctant guardian. What happened next would never be fully recounted the same way by any two witnesses. Some swore the creature advanced further into the street before collapsing back into silence. Others insisted it retreated into the broken SUV, as if tethered to the vehicle itself. A few claimed they saw officers drag Margaret's limp form away in the final seconds, her body barely clinging to life. But one detail remained consistent in every retelling. The moment the police, the neighbors, the onlookers, and the entire cul-de-sac finally understood why she hadn't left her car. It had never been about pettiness, never about power, never about her position on the HOA board. It had been about holding back something none of them could have comprehended until it stood before them. By dawn, the SUV was nothing more than a wreck, surrounded by barricades and floodlights, guarded by more officers than the neighborhood had ever seen. Margaret was gone, whisked away to an undisclosed location. The creature, or whatever it truly was, remained hidden within the wreckage, silent once again but never forgotten. And the neighbors who had once mocked her, shouted at her, and demanded she leave her car could only stand in silence now, forever haunted by the image of the woman who had sacrificed everything to protect them. The truth had been revealed in the most terrifying way possible. This was the moment the cops, and everyone else, finally realized why she hadn't stepped out.